Before we start, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. The wrongness settled into her awareness not when the threats came, not when the shouting started, but in the hollow quiet that followed her emergency call. That absence of sound carried more weight than any siren could. She stood on the cracked sidewalk outside the corner store, phone still pressed against her ear, listening to dead air where help should have been. The 911 operator had disconnected with practiced efficiency, polite, procedural, and utterly final. The kind of voice trained to end conversations before the caller finished explaining, before context could complicate the narrative already forming in some distant dispatch center. Her hand trembled slightly as she lowered the phone. Not from fear, exactly. This feeling was older than fear. It was the bone-deep knowledge of not being believed, of words weighed differently depending on who spoke them. Across the street, the white man who'd been screaming at her minutes earlier had fallen silent. He leaned against his expensive sedan now, arms crossed over his pressed shirt, watching her with the patient expression of someone confident in how this story would end. He'd stopped yelling the moment she pulled out her phone, stopped advancing, stopped doing anything that might look threatening to anyone who wasn't standing exactly where she stood. Now he simply waited, backlit by the street lamp, perfectly calm. The siren started as distant wails threading through the evening traffic. She felt a flutter of relief, 3 seconds of hope before reality reasserted itself. Because she'd been here before, in different cities, different circumstances. She knew how scenes like this were read, how quickly roles got assigned based on nothing more than appearance. The patrol car rounded the corner without urgency. No screeching tires, no dramatic arrival. Just 2 officers rolling up to what dispatch had probably coded as a disturbance. That careful language that meant they'd already decided which kind of situation this was before they'd seen a single face. The car doors opened in near-perfect synchronization. Neither officer looked at her first. Their eyes went to him, the man still leaning casually against his car, the picture of civilized patience. One officer nodded slightly in his direction, a greeting between people who recognized each other as belonging to the same world. Then, and only then, did their attention shift to her. She saw the assessment happen in real time, saw their postures change, hands drifting toward belts, stances widening into something between readiness and aggression. "Evening," the taller officer said, but he was looking past her, already constructing his version of events. "We got a call about a disturbance." "Yes, I called," she said, keeping her voice level despite her racing heart. "This man threatened me. He followed me from the store, got in my face, said he'd—" "Ma'am, I'm gonna need you to calm down," the shorter officer interrupted. His hand rested on his belt now, fingers drumming against leather. She wasn't yelling, wasn't advancing. Her hands were visible, empty, no sudden movements. But she was breathing hard, and her voice carried the vibration of adrenaline. And apparently, that was enough. "I am calm," she said, hating how the words came out tight and defensive. "He's the one who—" "Step back, please." The taller officer moved forward, positioning himself between her and the man who'd actually threatened her, protecting the wrong person. Behind them, barely visible in the gathering darkness, the white man's expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like satisfaction, like watching a familiar movie hit its expected beats. She pointed at him, trying to redirect their attention. "He followed me for 2 blocks. Told me I didn't belong in this neighborhood. Said he'd make sure I understood my place." "He? Ma'am, we're gonna need you to stop pointing and put your hands where we can see them." Everything shifted then. The air itself seemed to thicken. Both officers' hands moved to their weapons, not drawing, but ready. The shorter one circled slightly to her side, cutting off angles. This was the choreography she'd feared, the dance where she became the threat simply by being afraid. "My hands are right here," she said, raising them slowly, carefully, in a gesture of surrender she hadn't earned the need for. "I'm the one who called you. I'm the victim here. We'll determine that," the taller officer said. "But right now, you need to comply." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Comply. Not cooperate, not help us understand, not tell us what happened. Just submit to their authority, their version. their pre-written script where she'd already been cast as the problem. The white man finally spoke, his voice carrying the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted he'd be heard. "Officers, I appreciate you coming out. This woman became agitated when I asked her to move away from my vehicle. I was concerned for my safety. It was a masterpiece of inversion. The follower became the followed. The threatener became threatened. And his tone, reasonable, concerned, the voice of a taxpayer reporting a disturbance, landed exactly as he'd known it would. "That's a lie," she said. But her voice cracked on the words, undermining them with emotion, while his calm erased his guilt. "Ma'am, you need to lower your voice." The shorter officer stepped closer. "Are you under the influence of anything?" The question landed like a slap. She was a professional, dressed for the office she'd left an hour ago, speaking coherently, doing nothing but existing in public space while being afraid. But they looked at her and saw intoxication, instability, reasons to doubt. "No, I'm not. I just want you to listen." "We are listening, but you need to calm down." "Can you do that for us?" It was a trap wrapped in reasonable language. If she stayed upset, she was out of control. If she calmed down, the situation couldn't have been that serious. There was no right answer, no way to perform fear that would make them see her as someone deserving protection. She tried anyway, forced her breathing to slow, lowered her hands carefully. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, flatter, drained of the emotion they'd decided made her unreliable. "He threatened me. I have the right to walk down this street without being harassed. I called for help because I was scared." The taller officer exchanged a glance with his partner. Some wordless communication passed between them, a decision made without deliberation. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." The words didn't make sense at first. She stared at him, waiting for the punchline, the clarification, the moment where this scenario revealed itself as some terrible misunderstanding about to be corrected. "What? Why would I?" "Turn around. Now." His voice had hardened into pure command, the thin veneer of professionalism stripped away. "But I didn't do anything. He's the one who threatened me. I'm the one who called you. This is your last warning. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, or we will place you in restraints by force." Behind the officers, the white man uncrossed his arms and slipped his hands into his pockets. He wasn't smiling anymore, didn't need to. His expression carried something worse than satisfaction, inevitability. This was exactly how he'd known it would go. She turned around. What choice did she have? Fighting would only confirm their narrative, and running would get her killed. So she turned, placed her hands behind her back, and felt the metal close around her wrists with a ratcheting sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet street. The pressure was immediate and excessive. The cuffs bit into her wrists, tighter than necessary, tight enough to restrict circulation. She gasped, and the officer holding her arm jerked her upward. "Stop resisting." "I'm not—" Her protest cut off as her cheek pressed against the patrol car's hood, still warm from the engine. Someone's hand pushed against her back, holding her down, while another set of hands patted along her sides, her legs, invasive and humiliating under the streetlight's harsh glare. She could see the white man from this angle, still watching, still silent. He'd won without saying another word, had turned her emergency call into her own arrest by doing nothing more than standing there looking respectable, while she failed to perform victimhood correctly. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not where it would be used as more evidence of her instability, her unreasonableness, her guilt. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer began, his voice flat and procedural. The Miranda rights she'd heard countless times on television took on a different weight, when spoken over her while handcuffed and pinned against a car for the crime of being afraid. But what the officers didn't know, what couldn't know because nobody asked, because her humanity had already been decided, was that she wasn't the only one who'd made a call that night. The witness. Nobody noticed across the street, in the second-floor window of a weathered apartment building, Marcus Chen watched through glass that hadn't been properly cleaned in years. He was 73, had lived in this neighborhood for 47 years, and had developed the habit of watching his street the way some men watch television. He'd seen the woman walk past on her way home from the bus stop, had seen the white man in the expensive car slow down, pull over, get out, had watched the confrontation develop with the weary recognition of someone who'd witnessed this scene play out too many times in too many variations. When the woman pulled out her phone, Marcus had pulled out his own. Not to post on social media. He barely understood how that worked. Not even really thinking about what he'd do with the footage. Just recording because he'd learned, over decades of watching his neighborhood change while staying exactly the same, that some things needed to be documented before they could be believed. His phone was old, but steady. The camera wasn't sophisticated, but it captured what mattered. A woman standing on a public sidewalk. A man advancing on her aggressively, her backing away, his finger jabbing toward her face. The audio picked up his raised voice, the threats Marcus couldn't quite make out, but whose tone carried clearly enough. Then the police arrived, and Marcus kept recording. He captured the moment the officer's attention went to the man instead of the woman, caught the way their body language shifted when they looked at her, got clear footage of her hands raised, non-threatening, before the command to turn around. And most importantly, he recorded what came next. "Place of people like you is learning to obey," the shorter officer said, his voice carrying in the quiet street as he pushed her against the hood. Not a shout, just a casual observation shared between colleagues who assumed nobody who mattered was listening. The other officer laughed, brief, knowing, complicit. "Yeah, these ones always think the rules don't apply to them." Marcus's hand didn't tremble. The phone stayed steady. He'd been recording long enough to know that shaky footage gave lawyers excuses. This needed to be clear, undeniable. When they hauled her toward the patrol car, still handcuffed, when her foot caught on the curb and one officer yanked her upright with unnecessary force, when the white man finally walked back to his expensive sedan and drove away without giving a statement, Marcus captured it all. But he didn't upload the video to Facebook or Twitter or whatever platforms the young people use these days. He'd learned that going viral meant going nowhere. Lots of noise, lots of anger, rarely any actual change. Instead, he pulled up a contact in his phone, a name he'd added years ago after attending a community meeting. Someone who'd left a card and said, "If you ever see something that needs proper attention, call me directly." The phone rang 3 times before a crisp voice answered, "Civil Rights Division, Attorney Morrison speaking." "Ms. Morrison, this is Marcus Chen. We met at the community forum 2 years ago." He paused, watching as the patrol car pulled away with the woman in the back seat. "I have a video you need to see. The machinery of justice." The video reached Morrison's phone before the woman reached the police station. She watched it twice in her office, the sound turned low, her expression unchanging as years of practice kept her anger professional. By the time the woman was being processed, fingerprinted, photographed, her belongings cataloged into a plastic bag, Morrison had already forwarded the footage to 3 people. Her supervisor in the Civil Rights Division, a federal prosecutor she'd worked with on pattern and practice investigations, and a contact at the state attorney general's office who specialized in police misconduct. She included minimal commentary. Video shows racially motivated arrest. Officers made statements indicating bias. Witness willing to testify. Victim still in custody. Requires immediate review. The response came faster than usual. Maybe because the footage was so clear. Maybe because this was the 3rd complaint about these particular officers in 18 months. Maybe because the political climate had shifted just enough to make this particular kind of injustice slightly less ignorable. By midnight, while the woman sat in a holding cell trying not to think about whether she'd have a job tomorrow, if this went on her record, a series of quiet phone calls were being made. Not dramatic, no press releases or public statements, just the careful machinery of accountability beginning to turn. On the morning after, she didn't sleep. The cell was cold, the bench hard, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw the officer's face, heard the casual cruelty in his voice. "Place of people like you is learning to obey." Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the small window near the ceiling. She'd been arrested at 7 p.m. Nobody had told her what she was charged with. Nobody had asked for her side of the story. She existed in a bureaucratic limbo, where her guilt had been assumed, and the paperwork would eventually catch up with the conclusion. At 8:30, a guard she hadn't seen before unlocked her cell. "You're being released," he said, his tone neutral, giving nothing away. She stared at him. "What? Released? Get your things?" No explanation, no apology, just the same efficiency that had processed her and now processing her out. She followed him down corridors she didn't remember from the night before, her body moving on autopilot while her mind struggled to catch up. At the front desk, they returned her belongings without comment. Phone, wallet, keys, everything accounted for in the same plastic bag. She signed for them with hands that still bore red marks from the cuffs. "What about the charges?" she asked the clerk processing her release. "No charges filed." "But why was I arrested?" The clerk looked at her with the exhausted patience of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. "You'd have to ask the arresting officers. I just processed the paperwork." She wanted to scream, wanted to demand answers, accountability, some acknowledgement that what happened to her mattered, but she was too tired, too wrung out, and some survival instinct told her that making a scene now, even a justified one, would only create new problems. So she took her bag and walked out into morning sunshine that felt surreal after the fluorescent numbness of the holding cell. She'd made it halfway down the station steps when a woman in a gray suit intercepted her. "Excuse me, are you Desiree Thompson?" Desiree stopped, instantly wary. "Who's asking?" "My name is Catherine Morrison. I'm with the Civil Rights Division." She held out a business card. "Do you have a few minutes to talk?" "The video?" They went to a coffee shop 3 blocks from the station. Morrison bought them both coffee. Not to be nice, Desiree understood, but because people talked more openly with something warm to hold. "I need to show you something," Morrison said, pulling out her phone. "And I need to warn you, it might be difficult to watch." She turned the screen toward Desiree. The footage was crystal clear. Desiree watched herself from across the street, small figure under a streetlight, backing away from a man who seemed to fill the frame with aggression. Watched herself make the call. Watched the patrol car arrive. Watched the officers dismiss her, protect him, transform her fear into their justification. And then she heard it. Words she'd been too frightened to fully register in the moment. "Place of people like you is learning to obey." The casual racism of it, the assumption of impunity, the comfortable certainty that this was just how things worked, it all hit her like physical force. She'd known what happened was wrong, but hearing it, seeing it from outside herself, understanding that this was documented proof and not just her word against theirs, where did this come from? Her voice came out rough. "A witness. He's already given a full statement." Desiree looked up sharply. "Someone saw. Someone recorded. And before you ask, yes, he's willing to testify. Yes, the footage is authenticated. And yes, this changes everything." Morrison leaned forward slightly. "I know you just got out. I know you're exhausted and probably want to go home and pretend this never happened. But I need to know if you're willing to pursue this. Because this isn't just about you anymore." "What do you mean?" "These officers have been complaints before. Nothing formal enough to stick. Always their word against civilians who couldn't prove what happened. But this," she gestured to the phone, "this is evidence. Admissible, documented, undeniable evidence of bias and misconduct. If you're willing to make a formal complaint, we can open an investigation. We can make sure this actually means something." Desiree looked down at her coffee. Her hands were still shaking slightly. From exhaustion, from anger, from the adrenaline that hadn't quite drained from her system. "What happens to them?" she asked. "If the investigation substantiates the complaint, suspension pending review. Possible termination depending on what else we find. Criminal charges if the evidence supports it." Morrison's voice was matter-of-fact, laying out possibilities without promises. "But I won't lie to you. The system protects its own. Even with video evidence, even with clear bias, these cases are hard to win. Then why bother? Because every complaint creates a record. Every investigation makes the next one easier. And sometimes, if we're lucky and the evidence is solid and the politics align, sometimes we actually get justice." Morrison paused. "Plus, the man who threatened you, Once we started looking into this, we found out he has a history. Multiple complaints for harassment, always targeting black residents in his neighborhood. Never prosecuted because, like the officers, it was always his word against people the system didn't believe. But now we have him on video, and we have officers on video protecting him while arresting his victim. That's not just misconduct, it's a pattern. That's what we can build a case on. Desiree sat with it. Part of her wanted to walk away, to put this behind her, and never think about it again. Going home, taking a shower, sleeping in her own bed. That sounded like heaven compared to extending this nightmare. But another part of her thought about the officer's words. Place of people like you is learning to obey. Thought about every other black woman who'd walk down that street, take that bus home, encounter that man or those officers or the next version of them. Thought about whether her silence would protect anyone or just make it easier for it to happen again. What do you need from me? She asked. Morrison smiled. Small, professional, but genuine. First, your statement. Everything that happened, in your own words. Then we document your injuries. She gestured to Desiree's wrists, where bruises were already forming, and start building the case. It won't be quick and it won't be easy, but if you're willing, we'll see it through. Desiree picked up her coffee, took a long drink, and met Morrison's eyes. Let's do it. 6 months later. The investigation happened quietly at first. Internal affairs interviews, witness statements, forensic analysis of the video. The two officers were placed on administrative leave within a week, not as punishment officially, but as protocol during the investigation. They'd expected it to blow over. These things always did. But this time, the investigation didn't stop at internal affairs. The Federal Civil Rights Division took interest. Patterns emerged. The video Morrison had shown Desiree became Exhibit A in a broader case about discriminatory policing practices. The white man from that night, David Brennan, they learned, a real estate developer with aspirations of improving the neighborhood by driving out longtime residents, found himself facing charges of ethnic intimidation and assault. His lawyer tried to dismiss it as a misunderstanding. The video made that impossible. For Desiree, the months became a strange mix of normal life and surreal legal proceedings. She went to work, had dinner with friends, maintained her routines. But she also gave depositions, met with lawyers, prepared for testimony that might or might not happen depending on whether the case went to trial. Morrison called her one Tuesday afternoon in late spring. We have news, she said, and something in her voice made Desiree sit down. Both officers accepted plea agreements. They'll resign from the force, serve community service, and their certifications will be revoked. They can't work in law enforcement anywhere in the state. That's it. Desiree felt the disappointment rise sharp and bitter. Community service. That's not all. Brennan took a plea too. 2 years probation, mandatory bias training, and a restraining order keeping him away from your neighborhood. But more importantly, Morrison paused, the city agreed to a consent decree. Independent oversight of the police department, mandatory bias training, new accountability measures. It's not everything we wanted, but it's real systemic change. Desiree absorbed this. Not justice, exactly. The officers who'd treated her like a criminal would go home to their families, live their lives, probably find other jobs. Brennan would pay some fines, sit through some classes, and continue being wealthy and white and largely untouched. But they couldn't do this to someone else. Couldn't hide behind badges and assumptions. Couldn't turn victimhood into arrest with such casual impunity. There's something else, Morrison said. The witness, Marcus Chen, he wanted me to tell you something. What? He said he's been watching that street for 47 years. Said he's seen this happen more times than he can count. And he said, Morrison's voice softened slightly. He said you're the first person who made him believe it could end differently. The truth about winning Desiree went back to that street corner eventually. Not because she had to, but because she needed to prove to herself that she could. It looked different in daylight, smaller and more ordinary. Just another block in a city full of them. The store where it started, the sidewalk where she'd stood, the spot where patrol car had pulled up. They were all just places now, emptied of the terror they'd once held. Marcus Chen was sitting on his building's front steps, reading a newspaper in the afternoon sun. She walked over, suddenly uncertain. "Mr. Chen?" He looked up, studied her face for a moment, then smiled. "Figured you'd come by eventually. Have a seat." She sat beside him on the worn concrete steps. "Thank you," she said simply. "For the video. For calling Morrison. For doing what any decent person should do?" He folded his newspaper. "Don't thank me for basic humanity." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. "Did it feel like winning?" Marcus asked. "When you heard about the plea deals?" Desiree considered this. "Honestly, not really. I keep thinking about how it shouldn't have taken video evidence for anyone to believe me. How I shouldn't have had to spend a night in jail for being threatened. How those officers will be fine, really, in the end." "That's because you're confusing winning with justice," Marcos said. "Justice would be those officers facing real consequences. Justice would be a system that believed you in the first place. But winning?" He gestured down the street. "Winning is what happens next. Every traffic stop where an officer thinks twice because oversight exists now. Every complaint that gets taken seriously instead of buried. Every black woman who walks down this street and doesn't have to be afraid. That feels like a small victory. Small victories are how you build toward big ones. I've lived here long enough to know. Change doesn't come from one perfect moment. It comes from 1,000 small shifts. You created one of those shifts." Desiree looked at the street, at the ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, unaware of what happened here, unaware that the sidewalk they walked on had become briefly a battleground, and was now, maybe, slightly safer because of it. "The woman from the Civil Rights Division said you've lived here 47 years, she said. 47 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that I'm counting. Why stay?" Marcus smiled. "Because someone has to bear witness. Someone has to remember what this neighborhood was, what it survived, what it's becoming. Someone has to be the one who keeps recording until the truth can't be ignored anymore." He looked at her directly. "Now that someone is you, too." Epilogue. What dignity looks like. Desiree didn't become an activist. Didn't dedicate her life to police reform or civil rights litigation. She went back to her ordinary existence with her ordinary job, living her life with the same quiet determination she'd always had. But she kept Morrison's number in her phone, kept Marcus Chen's address written in her planner. When the local news asked for an interview about the consent decree, she agreed, spoke clearly and calmly about what happened, about why it mattered, about what needed to change. She didn't cry during the interview, didn't perform the trauma that cameras love to capture, just told the truth in measured words, with the same dignity she'd tried to maintain while handcuffed against a patrol car hood. The two officers found other work eventually, security jobs, private sector positions where their histories didn't follow them quite as closely. They told themselves they'd been unfairly targeted, that one bad night had destroyed their careers, that the system had failed them. They never acknowledged what they'd done, never apologized, but they couldn't do it again, and that had to be enough. Brennan moved to a different neighborhood, continued his real estate development with slightly more caution. He complained to his friends about political correctness, and how you couldn't even talk to people anymore without being accused of racism. He never connected his probation to his actual behavior, never understood that his words had weight beyond his intentions. He didn't need to understand, he just needed to stop. And Marcus Chen kept watching his street, kept his phone charged and ready, kept bearing witness, because some battles were won, not with single victories, but with sustained attention, with the patient accumulation of evidence that made denial impossible. Months later, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, Desiree was walking home from the bus stop. Same route, same time, same street corner. A young woman was ahead of her, and a car slowed down alongside. Desiree's heart rate spiked, old fear surging fresh. But this time, when the driver rolled down his window, he was just asking for directions. The young woman gave them, he thanked her, and he drove away. Just an ordinary interaction, the kind that happened thousands of times a day in cities everywhere. The kind that should have always been ordinary but hadn't been, not in this neighborhood, not for people who looked like them. Desiree exhaled and kept walking, She didn't win by making everything perfect. Didn't win by punishing everyone who'd wronged her, or by forcing acknowledgement from people incapable of giving it. She won by surviving with her dignity intact, by refusing to let fear make her smaller, by turning her worst night into the beginning of something slightly better for everyone who came after. That was what victory looked like when you weren't the person holding power. Not dramatic, not satisfying in the way movies promised, but real, incremental. Built from small moments of documentation and testimony and quiet refusal to accept that this was just how things had to be. And on that ordinary Tuesday, walking home under streetlights that no longer felt threatening, that was enough. If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe for more.